Hello and welcome to episode 96 of Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Brent.
I'm Will.
Are you sure?
Yeah, you know what? I'm sorry. I got an email and I was like, oh my God. I was like, I gotta hurry up and send this reply.
Oh boy. Okay. So anyway, we're back, guys.
Lady Gaga's tomorrow.
Crap, we're close to episode 100, guys. We gotta do something. Just thought about that.
Oh, yes.
But as promised last week, we're going to talk about Charle Jane Anders' book, Never Say You Can't Survive. And Brent's going to guide us through that this week. So I appreciate you all being here. I'm very excited to be sitting here again. What you got for us there, Brent? Let's do it.
All right. So Never Say You Can't Survive. It is a collection of essays that Charle Jane Anders wrote during the beginning of the plague in 2020. And it's just basically, it's like, well, honestly, it's hands down my favorite, like, writing, craft, advice, whatever you want to call it, book, like, ever. Like, number one, without a doubt. So, so I sing its praises a lot, and I really wanted to take the time to, like, kind of dive into it and you know, talk about it. But to start off with, just keeping it real general, I wanted to kind of like just broadly go over some of the themes in the introduction and just kind of like relate it to things we're working on, things that we have finished, or things that, you know, we want to work on, basically. And I say this because I know I have a whole ass novella coming out soonish, and Nick and Marshall over here have whole novels they're having to write soon. And me and Will just talked not too long ago about stuff he's working on. So I just thought it'd be cool to kind of like frame it through that lens. So, okay. So let me crack open the book here. I got it in front of me. All right. So we are starting with the introduction. And all right. So in 2020, like I said, when Charle Jane was writing this book, she talked about how imagining new worlds got her through that year, and just reminding herself that writing is an act of self-preservation, which I thought was really cool. So I wanted all of us to kind of look back on 2020. What was that like for us writing wise? And did we learn any lessons from trying to be creative during that year? So I think I'm going to kick it off with, I want to start off with, Nick. Okay, volunteers. Never mind, Nick. Get at it.
All right. So I got to say, I love the introduction. There's so much to uncover on this one, and I'm glad we get to start with it. 2020 for me was like a big year, though. Like, it wasn't just Kofi for me. I got married. I got kids. Like, writing-wise, like, there wasn't a lot happening in the beginning. Okay, well, make fun of me. Why don't you? I see your face. I see your face, Will.
No.
Oh, it's like, I'm so busy. I got kids now. Oh. me.
That's not right.
Come on. That's all I heard for 2 years straight.
That's a good impression.
What I was going to say. It was just when you're like, I got kids. It's like you acted like you just picked these kids up at the store. And we're like, all right, you're mine.
I mean, he kind of did. I mean...
He's like, well, I'm a Mormon now. I'm going to go pick up the kids at the supermarket.
I mean, it did kind of seem like it was like I'm Amazon delivery. Okay, the kids are here.
Yeah,
2-day delivery.
I felt like we were playing the game of life.
Hey, man, I spun the right dial. So I got married, and I have 3 stepkids now. And so writing for me was a really big adjustment period. I had to get more purposeful. I think I finished my first novel ever that same year at the end of the year. And I wrote through, man, I got laid off. I had a crappy job where it was really bad for me, but like I still was able to complete something, even though it was a terrible something by the end of it. But I still wrote, and I was still writing short stories along that way too. So it was, writing wise, it was really hard because there was too much of the other stuff going on for me to actually focus on it. But if I didn't write, things got even worse.
All right. Marshall, What was 2020 like for you writing wise? How was it trying to be creative in that year?
Horrible. I don't think I wrote much that whole year, if I'm being honest. I tried to write some stuff. I think I was writing some shorter stuff and around the context of the podcast and talking to you guys and stuff like that. Like, trying to put like short stories out there was about as much as I can muster. And I honestly don't think I might have done that a couple of times. Like 2020 was about surviving work, remote teaching, and like lockdown and rebuilding my fence. Like it was just all life stuff, One of the things I wanted to point out though, because 2020, and like I said, 2021 wasn't, I think the thing about 2021 for me, I know we're not talking about 2021, but like starting this program was a huge part of that. Like being able to like do something, like get my writing focused in some way, you know what I mean? Because 2020 was rough. But one of the things that I loved about this intro that Charle Jane points out, and it's literally on page 2. She says, people sometimes talk about escapist storytelling as a kind of dereliction of duty, as if we're running away from the fight. That's some garbage right there, because escapism is resistance. And I did a lot of escaping at the time, 2020. I was watching a lot of TV. I was consuming stories. I mean, during lockdown, my family, we watched pretty much the entire MCU in chronological order. I mean, rewatch Star Wars, like just consuming stories and escaping, I think helped keep me sane. Honestly, I don't think am I sane now? I don't know. It's a whole different thing. But the point is that we got through 2020, and I'm writing again, which is important. But yeah, I can't imagine being a Brandon Sanderson who their way of coping with the pandemic was writing 5 novels. Like I wrote like 2 stories. You know what I mean? Like it's really interesting how different people handle it. But anyway.
All right. Well, what about you? What was 2020 like for you writing wise?
I finished 2 short stories. And I did a half of a novel, which I actually haven't picked up since. It was for something totally different that I didn't tell anyone about. And that was it. It was interesting, the things that I wrote about, but I think people might correlate it because it was 2020. I think I just had more time to think about grief and death and the nature of moving beyond. Those kind of were the 2 themes of the short stories, and the half of the book that I wrote was I think way more like horror, bloody, and violent.
So yeah, I always feel guilty about when I talk about like my creativity in 2020, because 2020 was like a wellspring for me. Like I finished, I wrote a whole novel. FireCon happened. I edited the anthology with Tor. I did, it was like 2020 was actually a very good creative year for me. And I think for me, it was that way because as awful as all of that was, it actually forced me to slow down for the first time in years. Like I didn't have to deal with 3 hours of traffic a day anymore. I didn't have to try to squeeze in a workout in after work or before work. I didn't have to, try to make time for the social gatherings I would normally have made time for on the weekends. So I just had this wealth of free time that I didn't have before, and it all went into the writing. And it was like, and maybe that was my escape, but yeah, and I was able to consume so much more media than I had in years. Like I blew through like 3 whole anime shows in a couple of weeks. So creatively for me, it was like, I don't know, I was on fire. Yeah. And I always feel guilty about saying that just because I know what the rest of the world was looking like then.
I forgot. I wrote an angry essay that year. That was that was,
and it was on NBC Think.
Right.
Yeah. So that was the one creative thing I think I did that sparked the fact that I didn't write that much after, because I was doing like community stuff. Like I was like, I don't know, not inspired, but like just angry and wanted to try to figure out how to change things. And yeah, that was 2020. I forgot about that.
You know, I think also, I know a lot of people have said, Brandon wrote 4 books and everything, which I think is amazing because that's the way he deals with stress. But also, I hope no one listens to that and gets discouraged.
Right.
Because Brandon also has a lot of privilege, He and that doesn't take away of how hard he works and how creative he is. I'm not taking that away. He's super talented. Like, we love him. But I also want people, if they hear that, don't get discouraged, because Brandon also has been doing this as his full-time job for years and years and years. Yeah. He also has a great support system, so if you're a single mom and you didn't get to write anything for 2020, or you only got to write 3 sentences, like, yay you. One, you survived. One, you have kids, and you're doing it on your own. So any type of writing that you got to do in 2020, any type of creativity, even if it's just outlining or character sketches, that's still a win. Because sometimes just to do that is like a form of resistance.
Yeah. Inching forward is an inch of progress is still progress. And I think, too, is you also got to think about and come to terms with what your definition of success as a storyteller looks like. Because for some people, they just want to, and I always remember my one of my professors saying this. They're like, if I could only ever write one story like The Lottery, I would be happy. And so for him, it wasn't about money or having thousands of books out there. He just wanted to write one story that was as memorable as Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and that impressed on the collective consciousness as much as that. So that might be your goal. And if that's your goal, well, you don't have to write fast. So, I mean, think about, and just come to terms with what that means for you. And I think especially in this industry, there's unfortunately so many ways to fail. And I'm using little air quotes for that, fail. That, you got to figure out what success looks like for you, especially after 2020. Jesus. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that upended so many things and expectations that people had about the world. All right. So that was the framework that Charle Jane had going into it. And the second part of what she was talking about, writing as an act of self-preservation. So outside of just 2020, but in general, can you think of ways that your writing has been an act of self-preservation for you in like your own journey? Will, I want to start with you on this one, actually. Yeah. I feel like this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, oh God, how deep do we want to go?
As deep as you want to go. I'm not going to press. We don't have to do like deep sea mining if you don't want to. But.
No. I mean, for me, writing has always been a way of surviving. Especially, and it really started, I think, during my teenage years, because things were just chaotic and terrible. I needed a way to process things that were happening that I couldn't process consciously. So I created stories and as a way to deal with multiple different traumas. And then later on, when other things were just terrible once again, after some like really amazing years, writing was also another way that I could channel that energy. But I'll say this, I'm not someone who likes to write when they're upset. I actually write my best and most frequently when I'm happy. You know, like, I don't like giving that, like, oh, you have to be a tortured artist to create great work. I don't believe that. But I definitely have learned to channel my energy and stress through writing. So for me, it's just a way that's healing. And also it aligns me with my anger. And I think having an outlet for anger is really good. It's not that it makes me less angry. Sometimes it actually makes me more angry, but you can channel anger in a way that it's not destructive. You can channel anger in a way that is righteous and positive. It can create something positive out of your anger. And I think that's a lot of times we view as like anger is bad and you need to suppress it. Not really. It's what you do with that anger. It's how you're going to channel it and how you're going to focus it. And, you know, I really do believe that the pen is mightier than the sword. The way that you can connect with people and with yourself through words and through the stories that you're telling is just, you know, pretty cool.
All right. I won't toss that off to you, Nick. When has writing been an act of self-preservation for you?
I'm going to be honest. I don't think it ever has.
That's a fair answer.
Maybe that's like, I process emotions really well, and I'm very emotional aware of myself and what I'm going through. However, that doesn't mean I don't process emotions through writing. One thing I learned through the MFA program, I wrote a short story that first summer about PTSD and processing that and things like that. And that actually helped me uncover a lot of my stuff that I was struggling with that I didn't know about. But I wouldn't call it like an act of self-preservation at that point. I think it was more of an act of self-awareness, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, nah, totally. All right, Marshall.
Yeah.
Kick it to you before I jump in here.
Yeah, no, I want to kind of go back to something Will said about anger. And like, I feel like if I'm angry and I'm writing, it's not fiction. You know what I mean? Like, it's usually some sort of way to process whatever is going on in the world, you know, around me. And I'm writing something to kind of just deal with that. Like, but as far as writing as an act of self-preservation in general, well, I like what Charle Jane says here. If you're angry, stay angry. Anger is the best fuel for writing. And yeah, I think it depends on what you need to process. And I think Nick is right there too. It's like, it doesn't work the same way for everybody, but at the same time, if I'm writing fiction, a lot of times that's not my act of self-preservation. That's usually when I dive into something else, you know what I mean? Or like, if I'm angry about something, I'll write some piece of nonfiction or dive into some other world, you know what I mean? But then when I really get into it, I'm not sure, speaking of sanity again, I'm not sure if I would be the same person if I didn't write though. So I think that anytime I'm writing, it's preserving who I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I guess for my part, I think the self-preservation as writing happened a lot earlier in my writing years. I think when I was like a teenager or in my early 20s, it was definitely more of an act of self-preservation, and in the ways I realized and didn't realize until later. So, you know, being a gay teenager in the South, heavy religious, all that, blah, 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 expressing any kind of like desire or attraction for another man just wasn't something I could openly do. But, you know, I was able to express that part of myself in the worlds I created, in the male characters I created, And, I always, there's this one story I tell, but I wrote this god awful fantasy novel when I was like, I don't know, 20, 21. And, I let a friend read it. And so, after he read it, he came to me and he was like, Brent. He kind of like whispered. He was like, do people know? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, do they know you're gay? And I was like, what? What do you mean? He was like, Brent, like, yes, this is like the way you wrote it, the way you described the men, the way you like talked about it, the way you had them interact with each other. And so, so I think in that way, very early on, at least, the writing, was definitely an act. Like I was throwing out a life raft for myself and didn't realize it. But yeah,
yeah, it made me think. I do know the first time it was through self-preservation, through anger. I was out sick in 8th grade for about 4 days, and my 8th grade teacher, Mrs. Domenico, had the class write a future story of the class. This enrages me now even more. And 5 guys wrote separately, maybe they did this together and thought it would be funny, that I died of AIDS. And that, when I found out, because one, I was absent, so like, why would I want to find out? But everyone started telling me this. And that is when I started writing as a means of like, well, I'm going to kill these motherfuckers off in my story and it's going to be fucking bloody. But I think it was also a way for me to not turn inward and, or outward and beat them up. I beat them up later. That was my first, I think, when I really wrote something because I was angry at people's just meanness towards me. And it really started fueling my writing.
So, okay, that's actually, wow. That you kind of set my next question up like perfectly, honestly. So I'm just going to run with it. And I'm just going to have you answer first since you kind of like did it. All right. So what advice or thoughts do you have on someone kind of struggling through writing through their bleakest moments? Because that's something Charle Jane talks about, especially in terms of 2020 and just the weight of that year. And unfortunately every year since. But yeah, what would be your thoughts or, advice on somebody trying to write through those moments? Because what you described was pretty bleak. So I'll let you.
As the ambulance goes through my door.
Yeah, even more.
In the background.
The universe is giving you everything.
Yeah. I would say for your own health, for your own mental state, create. Because creation is a form of self-love. And my Sifu, my Kung Fu teacher as a kid, when we would meditate, he would always talk about training your mind, right? And I would always be like, but Sifu, like, I'm not concentrating. I only got to like meditate for like literally 20 seconds. That's the only time that my brain was like calm. And his response was, it's 20 seconds more of peace than you had before that. So when you're going through your bleakest moments, just writing a sentence, just writing a character sketch, just writing a plot point is more than you had before, and you're feeding yourself, you're nourishing yourself, because none of us, when we start creating, are thinking, I mean, maybe you are, I'm just not that bold, I'm going to be a millionaire off of my books, this is what's going to happen. You're creating because of a deep need to create. And when you're going through something that's just so hard and so bleak, give yourself that grace and just create, even if it's small. Because it's the same way of when you like plant a tree. You just give it a little water every day and a little bit of light, and it keeps growing. And that's the way you got to look at your writing.
That's a good start to this. So I'm gonna roll the ball along. I'm gonna pass it to Marshall.
Yeah. So I don't know. I was thinking too along these lines as far as advice goes. One of the things I was saying earlier was how, and Charle Jane said this too, is escapism is important, you know, and whether that be consuming someone else's art or creating your own. But I know one of the things that that I think is really important for a lot of creators right now is seeing yourself on the screen or seeing yourself on the page, right? So if you're not seeing yourself, or your story isn't being told and you need to tell that story, like Will was saying, that's the time to put yourself on the page and to create that thing, you know, and so that you can see not only yourself, but your family reflected and your community reflected, as a form of processing some of this stuff too, because I know for me, I know a lot of the anger and stuff that I deal with day to day in the community I live in is feeling unseen and unheard and like just ignored, you know? And so figuring out a way to make yourself seen, whether that be starting a freaking podcast or writing a short story or whatever that looks like, or, you know, making a freaking YouTube video of yourself on vacation, like, look at me, I'm Black and doing this badass thing in this part of the country, like whatever that is, like I think is really important. So, yeah, that's my advice. Figure out a way to see yourself.
All right, Nick, what do you got?
Man, so if you don't have this on audiobook, I think you should, because Charle Jane reads it themselves, and it's really good. It's really empowering. What I took away from the intro and the first couple chapters is giving yourself the permission to write. Not just write in general, but write that story that you want to write. Write about fairies if you want to. Write about your deep-seated anger, emotions that you're having right now. Give yourself the permission to not only feel it, but to write it, to put it into your work. And that's kind of like my big takeaway and advice is go write it. Go do that thing you want to do. There's nothing stopping you. There's no reason like you can't just write it for yourself and then bury it and put it in a trunk.
Will, you want to throw something in there?
Yeah, because I just want to talk about this for a minute, because I know if you've listened to the podcast in the past, you're like, I kept thinking I didn't have value with what I was going to say, right? But if you still feel like that, like, I don't know what I have to say, I don't know if anyone wants to listen or anything else like that, it's even more reason why you need to write. Because it's not sometimes always about what you think. Sometimes we're way too in our head. We're way too hard on ourselves. So even if you don't have anything, you're adding anything to the conversation, even if you don't think you have value in that way, do it anyway.
Yeah.
And one of the things too I want to throw out there too is I keep bringing this up, Brent, by the way. I hope you don't mind. But whenever we're out, you know, talking in my MFA program and with other community, I'm just like, you know, me and my buddy Brent, man, sometimes we just want to see Black folks riding dragons and shit. Like,
yeah,
like the story I'm setting out to write, it's a Black space opera, and it's just like Black folks having space adventures, and like the other shit is there, but like, if that's what you need to do, like that's what I need to do right now. I need to write something fun. I need to write something cool. I need to write something that I can see myself in. You know what I mean? And I think that's super important to a lot of the things we've been talking about for the last, I don't know, however long the four of us have been together. I lose track of time, COVID. But, you know, but I mean, we've been having these conversations for all this time, but like, it's about creating what you want to see as well as processing what you're going through.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess my thought would be it make sure you're writing to the bleak moment and not that you're running away from it. And what I mean by that is don't let the writing be a distraction from you dealing with whatever emotion the bleak moment is bringing on. We'll probably talk about this more once we get into the novella stuff. So I don't want to like dive too deep, but I probably, if I'm being 100% honest with myself, I probably shouldn't have drafted that novella when I drafted it, because I did damage to myself writing that novella when I did. And the reason I say that is because, this is something I just honestly just had to recently kind of like come to terms with and grapple with, is that, my writing mentor of like, I don't know, almost 10 plus years died the month before I started drafting the novella. And I never dealt with it. I avoided it. I didn't want to think too deeply about it. I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. I talked to a couple people about it briefly, but it was just something I avoided, and I just wrote, and every word of that novella was painful. I will be honest with you, that and I guess it's a testament that, my editor was like, oh, this is a lot of fun. It was very exuberant. Like this stuff jumped off the page. And for me personally at the time, it was agony. Like it was not something I was enjoying doing. And I didn't realize until recently, I was like, oh, that's why it sucked so bad. It's because I used it to run away from something and not to speak to something, right? So if you're dealing with the bleak moment and you're trying or wanting to write through it, make sure it's healing you, and not that you're just trying to avoid the cut, I guess. So yeah, I don't want to get too deep into it because I know we'll probably talk about it later, because I know Will wants to do his deep dive, and that will probably be, stuff that will probably come up then. But
bring tissues.
All right, well, yeah, but
I'm kidding. I'm not going to try to make you cry.
I mean, it was a thing. I had to kind of realize, like, oh, that's what it was. Grief was in the background of writing this thing the whole time, and it wasn't being dealt with. And I don't think that's what Charle Jane means when she's talking about writing to the bleak moments. Don't use it to avoid processing the things that you need to process.
Or I would also say is try not to let any type of grief swallow you if you're writing about it.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes really hard. It's sometimes hard to not let that grief swallow you as you're writing about it, even unconsciously. I learned that the hard way. It's not
for the week.
It's not fucking fun.
No.
Because I was fucking crazy the first month of this year. So
because it sucks you in. It's like this hole, and it's just like it pulls you in, and that not only does it pull you in, it cocoons you, and it won't let you out.
Yeah, and I think when you're a creative person, and whether it's through words or it's through art, and you're in that space, you start to view every interaction through that space, and that's not healthy. Sometimes you have to let go and be like, you know what, everyone, and I had to apologize to the three of you. I'm crazy right now. I'm sorry. Like, I am not myself, and that's just sometimes just happens when you're a creative, I think sometimes.
Yeah, no, and sometimes, Marshall, you had yours. I'm going to let you go first.
No. I finish your thought, because I have a follow-up to what you guys are talking about.
Well, I was going to kind of mention, like, good art will bring those emotions out of you in a healthy way. So what kind of made me realize, like, that was the grief I had been avoiding was the recent Wakanda movie trailer that came out.
Oh, that trailer was ridiculous.
And it made me bawl. And I watched it over and over and over again. I kept bawling, and I was like, why? I was like, what the fuck is wrong with me? And then I realized, I was like, oh, Derek would have loved this movie. Derek was the one who taught me about Black Panther. Derek was the one that, like, sitting, so I just realized, I was like, oh, I never dealt with that. And for whatever reason, those 2 minutes and 30 seconds, like, cut right to the core of something I had been avoiding for a year and some change almost. So,
and to be fair, that song didn't help either. That song was ridiculous.
No,
so good. So here's my follow up to what you guys are talking about. I want to know, and this goes back to what Charle Jane is saying, I think, too, ultimately. But what do you do then if you find yourself caught up in, you're working through it, but like you guys are saying, there are moments where the words hurt, or you're going to a place that you didn't expect. Like, what do you do? Because I know folks in our writing communities go through this, and so I don't know if we're throwing advice around. What do you do? Well,
so this happened with my novel. I couldn't understand why I couldn't get through this one part, because it wasn't an emotional part. It was just a part that I wasn't going to the next act, right? Like, I knew what was happening, but I couldn't write it for some reason. It wasn't writer's block. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. And therapy, everyone, because writing is cathartic, and writing can be healing, but writing does not take the place of therapy. Okay, no art does. My therapist was like, you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with abandonment issues, and it's coming out in this way because this is what your story is actually really about. And it was like, no, it's not. It's a space opera heist. What are you talking about? And then I actually read it, and I started seeing oh, this is why I can't get through this part. So I needed to do work on me feeling what I was feeling and not write it, because sometimes you have to write something else. And so I wrote some short stories. I reworked my one short story, made it into a novella, because even though that dealt with grief, that felt like a safe place to allow my grief and trauma to be handled. It hasn't been until recently that I really could come back to my novel and be like, okay, I processed those emotions, and now I'm really ready to handle them in this way that it's coming out. But I know that I can actually stick to the story, and the story isn't 100% my life story. I can channel those emotions in different ways.
Yeah. Therapy is a good one. I think honesty with yourself too is a big thing. Just, you got to be honest if it's hurting you or if it's not doing what you needed to do. If I was smart, I would have been like, hey, can we postpone this by 6-7 months? Because it wasn't, I had the double whammy. And again, I know if I do more of this on the deep dive with the novella, but I had the double whammy. I had just lost my writing mentor a month before I was starting to draft it. And then I had a bit of an unrequited romance come in the same month I started drafting, as I'm writing a novel about two people very much deeply in love. Something I probably should not have been trying to touch with a 10-foot pole that I really didn't want to touch. But I was so determined to be, I guess, not admit that I was emotional about these things that I pushed through, and don't do what I did, because it only hurts you in the end. And I don't just mean in terms of that story, but in terms of your writing, it damaged me. I haven't actually felt like writing was something I could do again until maybe I don't know, right before summertime of this year. So just be honest with yourself when it's time to stop something and to take a break, or to accept that, hey, this maybe isn't a project I need to touch right now. So that would be my advice on that.
Nick?
I had a follow-up question for Brent, but he answered it because you said it hurts you. And I was going to okay, how does it hurt you? Writing-wise, emotionally, therapy-wise?
It did it on all fronts, because it was just literally I was going to the computer or the notebook, whichever I was writing with that day, and literally writing the thing that reminded me of the thing that was hurting me the most, in the two things that were hurting me the most in that moment. And the one I recognized, and the other I didn't recognize until later. But yeah, so literally it was like I was literally like just jamming a knife in me every day, and I was sitting down and writing, and not in the good Hemingway way where he talks about bleeding on the page. Like, no, I was like just emotionally wrecking myself day after day after day. And yeah, so it does damage, I think, on all fronts, but especially if we're talking about writing, it made it that much harder to write anything else, because after a while, writing became associated with this painful ass thing. And so, yeah, don't do that.
I also think like when I think about like Carrie Fisher, when she was writing her novel, she was going through rehab. She was going through like a lot of heavy points of her life. And she did use writing as an escape, but she would always say, it took me a little bit longer to write that book because I needed to take a break, because everything was just too raw. And I would not be good to myself, and I would not be good for the story that would be coming out, and you need to take a break. So I think, you kind of think about that, because yes, when something painful or tragic happens, something creative and beautiful can happen, but let's not go with that. You have to be a tortured artist to create great art, because that's not true at all.
Right. And don't, yeah. And at the end of the day, the person, I mean, I don't know if this is even controversial, but I feel like the person's more valuable than the art. Save the person. Like, the art can
100%.
wait.
Yeah, because they'll be able to create more art, better art, when they're in a place to do that.
Right. So, yeah. Nick?
All right. So I love going last, but also at the same time, can you feed me the original question before I start crying over everything?
I know.
I'm with you, Marshall. I'm with you on here, right? Like, I could see you. I see your chat.
Yeah,
I know. No. I took it there.
You need to go there, though.
Well, I think Marshall actually had a question, though, that was different than the one I was planning. I think it was the one about, like, what was it, Marshall? Like, writing through?
Yeah, what do you, if you find yourself in that place, what do you do to get through it? Obviously, therapy, you guys were talking about these other things, but like, we all end up in these moments where we want to write, but can't write. And if we are writing, sometimes it hurts. So what do we do?
So to tackle that question, right? I mean, we had a great residency, Marshall. A lot of my answers are coming from that and what I've learned from those sidebar conversations. Like,
yeah, it was a long couple weeks.
It was. I feel like when you're in that position and you're writing something, and it is more, for lack of a better word, traumatic. Your character's going through that too. Mm. And I think sometimes one of the pieces of advice that we got was, take your character out of the situation. Write something different with your character, or write your character processing that emotion. Because it's that, in a sense, that's you processing your emotion as well. And I feel like if sitting down to write, especially for you, Brent, like if sitting down to write is becoming painful every time you do it, right? A little bit of emotional awareness on this. Like, hey, when I sit down to write, how am I feeling? How am I feeling afterwards? When I'm writing this emotional scene, like, am I good? Am I not? How's my character feeling? Because Hemingway, you'll bleed on the page. Whether you know it or not, that shit came out, right? And so I think a little bit of emotional awareness and emotional intelligence on yourself, and checking on yourself and checking on your character who's now going through this with you. If you find yourself, it's painful and it's hard and you can't get through it, take your character and write something else for a little bit. Push them into something else where they cannot be in that feeling again, so we can reprocess that emotion. And it goes back to the conversation on our last episode, right? Plot versus structure. Right?
Yep.
So now we have you're going through something, you have to put it into the plot, and now it's in your structure, right? So tying all those things together, like, it's a lot.
Yeah, no, it's a heavy it's a heavy discussion. Wow. I wasn't exactly planning this when I planned out the questions, but no, I like it. I'm glad we kind of went this route. All right, so I guess this maybe this is just going to be in the same vein, but Charle Jane also talks about like turning your fears into stories, and like she mentioned, I think, kind of talking about some of like her fears about being trans in America and how she channeled that into a short story. So I'm gonna ask all of you: have you ever done that in your work, where you've taken one of your own fears and turned it into a story? So I'm gonna start with you, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. My short story from last summer. It's being helpless is a trigger for me when it comes to my like PTSD and stuff like that. So I put a character in a position where he was helpless and couldn't do anything about it and was stuck in his own head. And that was hard. Man, that was so hard to write for me at that time. Little tidbit, Marshall's in that story, and I loved it. And Marshall's the person that helps that character get through it. I totally lost my train of thought now because I'm thinking about Marshall and his wise words to me all the time.
I know it's
bromance. Go golfing together. Wear your polos.
We'll go golfing and get matching polos and shorts. It's okay.
Oh, I can't wait. But no, you're right though, Nick. That summer we both chose stories that were challenging in that same way. Like I threw out fear of my kids being bullied like I was, and that was the crux of the story that I wrote.
That was a hard summer. Now to think about that,
yeah. But I mean, we both
cried.
Well, we were crying, we were writing, we were crying, we were back and forth. But like the idea behind it for me though was like, okay, I'm putting my character in this situation because I fear that my kid will be in this situation like I was when I was, you know what I'm saying? And so that was kind of the whole thing. I don't remember what the point of the question was at this point, but if we could redirect me, I might be able to wrap.
So it's just about like, have you ever? You actually answered it, but it was just have you ever like used your fears to turn it into a story, and like how you've done that?
Right, and that was the fear. The fear is I don't want the last thing I want is my kids to deal with what I went through when I was their age, you know, and so writing that was difficult, but it helped me process that a little bit in knowing that they're going to be okay. And I'm also here for them in a different way than my parents were, you know what I'm saying? So it was a little reassurance, I think, on that level too. So, yeah.
All right. Will, what about you?
Just for the record, Will's been making beaker faces at everybody for the last 10 minutes, and
saw it.
I just want to call you out for that. Okay.
Get your polo shirts.
Go golfing, you bros.
Everyone's gonna think I'm evil. I think I've put in some of my stories of when my greatest fear actually happened. And I think that's given me perspective with everything else that's happened. I think any of my other fears, it's always weighed against with a big event that happened in my life that really just changed everything. So I think what my stories do is allow me to heal from that by dealing with things of grief and death, because it constantly comes up in all of my work in different ways. Some of it's really good. Some of it's not so good. Some of it's very sad. Some of it is complex. With my novel, I think it's complex about abandonment and death. And I think that's okay. I don't think I'm trying to, you know what? I'm not even trying to answer anything the way that I'm feeling about grief. I'm just, because I feel so many different things about grief, right? This whole entire idea that there's 7 stages of grief, I don't believe it for a minute. I don't think time heals everything. It does not. I think what happens is you have moments where you can cope better than others, but when something deeply changes you, like grief, it will be a roller coaster for the rest of your life. And that's not that's not a pessimistic thing to say. It's a thing of like, it's okay if you're 23, 29 years later, having a moment and having still to grieve about it. And then most of the time you're fine. And then you can laugh about things, and you can laugh about something that's morbid that happened. So I feel like, that's what I try to put in my stories, I think, unconsciously.
Well, I'm glad you do, because I wholeheartedly agree with what you just said. I mean, we don't have 7 stages of joy. I don't know why the hell we have to say.
That's a good point.
Exactly. And you know what? If anyone ever says like, oh, everything happens for a reason.
Oh, God.
No, motherfuckers. It does not.
Yeah.
Life is chaotic and random, and terrible things happen.
Well, and then my thing is, even if you truly really believe that, do you think someone in that moment, in that situation, needs to hear that?
Right.
That's what they need to hear.
It's not helpful.
Anyway, yeah, I could go on the whole rant about that, but I know we're coming up on time
with baseball bats, spikes,
with rusty nails in it. Yeah, like just
exactly. May you get an infection from that.
Yeah.
So we're wrapping up the introduction of Charle Jane Anders.
Sorry, yeah. Way to wrap it up. There was some things we actually didn't get a chance to cover, which we may later. But yeah, no, this was a really good discussion. Like I said, this is just broad strokes of some of the things Charle Jane is going to talk about further in the book. There's actually a lot. The introduction is really rich, so there's a lot we didn't even get a chance to cover in here. But what we did cover, as you can tell, really great start for the book. Is really awesome, and I'm hoping that through these discussions, everyone kind of feels empowered to like go out there and just write. I'm not even going to say like write a good story. Write a story that feels true to you, because we get so caught up in good or bad stories that we forget to write the stories that actually matter to us. So I'm hoping that's what this book and all these discussions bring out.
Yeah, and I want to remind everyone that this is a multi-part episode because we're really going to unpack this book, and we're going to have lots of questions for each other, and it's going to be a fun ride, and we'll have a break when we do Brent's interview for his novella that comes out in October. Right, Brent?
Yeah, so some of what I talked about today, I guess, will probably be a little more in-depth in that particular discussion.
Way in-depth.
Yo, I'm so excited because I don't have to read a book a week for school. I can fully read your stuff now.
For this novel, though, don't forget.
Well, that honestly,
Marshall,
there's a reason that what I've been telling y'all is like part of the reason y'all didn't read earlier drafts is that I just was not in a place where I felt like I could even share that thing with anybody. But
I get it. That's totally okay.
But now y'all will get to see it, and we could talk about it in all its whatever when the time comes.
All its glory.
Can't wait.
Number 1 bestseller for 52 weeks in the year.
Ooh.
Just waiting for it to get to my house at this point.
We'll get that house he wanted.
No, I'm waiting for the book to get to my house. If anybody wants to buy me a house, I'm fine with that as well.
Okay.
When I win the Powerball, I got you.
Oh boy, we lost that.
When you sell your book.
All right, time to go. All right. Good job, team. You guys are crazy. And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.